So the first topic is kind of like the end goal, but as many of you know, there's a practice within the tradition of making the goal the path. So I'll start with the goal. The goal is being a spiritual activist. A spiritual activist. So what does that mean? Let's talk first about being just a spiritual practitioner. And by spiritual practitioner, I mean anything that you do, any activity that you do that connects you with wisdom and compassion, or with the divine, or with whatever is sacred to you. So that might be dancing, or walking in nature, or meditation, or prayer, or yoga, or qigong, heartfelt dialogue, you know, service to others, etc., etc., etc. So many expressions of spiritual practice. The key being it connects you more to wisdom and compassion and to whatever is sacred to you. And the benefits of that run the whole gamut, from better health to greater psychological well-being, to the ability to handle stress, right? There's all those, you know, ones that have been studied very scientifically, and we have lots of proof of how well yoga helps you and all of that, and those are great. But I want to focus on a few sort of within the context of our conversation today. And those are, it gives you a greater connection to yourself, and that the quality of that connection is deepened through your practice. There's this inner self, which is, I think, where inner way gets its name, that you become more attuned with, and therefore even more attuned with others, with the world, with life, and so forth. So a practice can bring that to us. Become that place, that in that quality of connection, brings us to a ground of being in and within ourselves, which has a steadiness to it, a clarity, a perspective that we can grow from. It gives us strength, it gives us courage. It also gives us what is very important in our discussion today, and what I'm calling a space bar, like the, you know, on your computer. So we have things happen in our lives. We see things that are horrible, or we read something that shocks and outrages us, and we react because we're literally having a primal physiological event occurring in this organism called me, right? For each of us. And what your practice does for you, and for me personally, I find to be the most important aspect of what my practice does for me, is it gives me a space bar so that I can be inside that, particularly inside of fear, you know, be fighting or flying or freezing or fainting, and yet still have just a space, just the tiniest little space, so that I can access my other resources. So that my front lobe, which when you're having a fear reaction particularly, almost totally shuts down. At least it malfunctions to a great degree. But if you're doing a regular practice, and remember that's quite self-defining what that practice is. If you're doing a regular practice, what you'll find is that you have the space to access your values. You have the space so that you're higher functioning, your ideals, love, you know, the things that are important to you, who you want to be as a person in the world, you can access them still. The primal brain doesn't completely take you over. It doesn't completely take you over. So to me, this is one of the greatest benefits of doing some kind of practice. And that understanding of wisdom, that heart-opened compassion, is an experience of how I want to be in the world, right? That's the other thing that my practice gives me. It makes me response-able, right? Able to respond in ways that are grounded in what I believe to be important, what I believe to be my values, right? So that's what doing a regular spiritual practice is and does for us. And then let's look at activism. or being an advocate. And by this, I mean any actions to create social, political, economic, environmental change, positive change, for the good of ourselves and for others. There's a wide variety here as well, and certainly a self-definition of what those actions can be. But I'm thinking about things like petitions and protests and boycotts and demonstrations and nonviolent resistance and lobbying and community building and using dialogue and direct action, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It can absolutely be your own, of your own definition. I was in a meeting for a research company that I do work for, and this was when the riots first started, and I just asked, and they could have turned me down. I wasn't forcing it on anybody. I just asked if we could have 30 seconds of quiet together, just to pray for peace in whatever way prayer worked for each person, but just to take a moment to call out peace, evoke peace. To me, that was activism. And so it can be completely self-defining what those actions are and what that means for you. But it's a passionate engagement with life, with yourself, with other people. And the benefit of it, the greatest benefit, I mean, there's a number of them, but the greatest one is feeling really good about what you're doing in the world. The righting of wrongs, the helping and supporting of people who are vulnerable in whatever way they are vulnerable. The making the world a better place is the most satisfying feeling I think anybody could have. In fact, career activists, according to research, tend to have a very high level of satisfaction in their careers. So both of these extremely positive behaviors, acting towards the good of ourselves and others, and practicing a connection, a deep interconnection with ourselves and others, are incredible behaviors, but they have an underbelly, a shadow side, if you will, that can make them as negative a force as things that we would consider to be negative, you know, essentially, if you will. So the shadow side of activism is a kind of martyrdom, right? It's sacrificing your health, sacrificing your financial stability, sacrificing your well-being, sacrificing your connections that are important, like family and friends and so on, as a kind of act of self-emulate, you know, what's the word when you burn yourself? Somebody was going to jump and tell me the word. Okay.
Immolation.
Immolation. Thank you. It's like an act of self-immolation, and this can lead to incredible mental breakdown, really, right? The sense of fatality that you can work on a cause for years and years and years and kind of not really see much change can lead to depression, giving up, the lack of recognition and support that activists often have to endure, the hardship of it all, the lack of progress in the area of your concern, the heartbreak, right? The absolute heartbreak around whatever the cause is that you're working with. I remember being at a conference of in the not-for-profit sector, which I worked in for over 30 years. And it was the keynote speaker. There was about 2,000 of us there. Keynote speaker asked us all to stand up. And then he started naming off how long you've been in the industry, and then you were to sit down. So people who had been in the industry for less than 5 years, sit down. And half the room sat down because there's a very young, enthusiastic, passionate entrance point for not-for-profit sector. So half the room sat down. And then he went on to 10 years, 15 years, and so forth. He got to 25 years, and there was only 5 of us standing. There was only 5 of us left standing. What does that tell you about the burnout level among activists? It's very, very sad. It's very sad, but you can understand it, you know? That feeling of futility, the depression, the continuous struggle that activists can sometimes be caught up in, that makes them defensive, self-righteous. It can fill them, actually, they start out great, and then they can actually get filled with hatred for anybody who doesn't agree with their point of view. So there's a really, negative underbelly to being an activist. How about the shadow of the spiritual practitioner, right? How about that shadow, right? And I'm not even talking about like the delusional, drink the Kool-Aid, negative spiritual beliefs, manipulative spiritualism. I'm not even talking about that, right? I'm just talking about people who sincerely go to practice, and that their practice is a good practice. There's still a shadow there. There's the over surrender, where you literally give up all agency and all responsibility for your behavior to whatever authority exists within that particular practice, right? That's a shadow. The spiritual bypass, sort of like, it's all good, everything's fine, because I'm a spiritual person, right? So it's a kind of bypassing of the reality of the situation based on your spirituality. Then there's the bliss junkies. I'm just going to be here in my blissful meditation cushion. I don't have to worry about the world. Just float away, because our practices can be blissful. They can generate bliss, and that's wonderful. But if we use them to escape, then we're in the shadow side. We're in the shadow side of the practice, and it can disconnect us very terribly, so that we really don't connect with other human beings anymore. We don't connect with concern for them, and that is not what our practice is about. Lama Marut used to say, we're practicing any authentic path is to make us better for others, right? For others. And the shadow side is that we can use our path to make us think we are better than others. That's the shadow. It can also lead to psychological, psychic breaks, a destabilization mentally, depression, and so forth. So both of these have their shadows. They have all their positive benefits. There's absolutely no question of that, but they do have their shadows. And I think spiritual activism can act as a remedy for those shadows. And what it is it's the marriage, right, of spiritual practices with action in the world. They come together, and that marriage brings power and peace and strength and heart and compassion and wisdom of the spirituality, while we're connecting deeply with real action in the world and bringing those two together. This actually is bringing together the most powerful fires of the human psyche. The passion and the drive for the divine, for a deep connection, with something of beauty that is actually our essence, but is also somehow beyond us. It also fuses together our passion for justice, right? Our passion to be in support of and to provide the well-being for ourselves, for those we love, and for others. And that has been, behind the drive. That combination has been the driver behind so many great liberations of the past, right? So many great movements of the past. You think of the Gandhis and the Dalai Lamas and Bishop Tutu and Mandela and so many others that we could name, who are beautiful models of spiritual activists. But you can see at the heart of them was this deep inner heart and strength, right? And then they took action in the world. And so that's what it is to be a spiritual activist. If we're going to survive as a species, as a planet, then I think we're going to need to do both of these things. We're going to need to take action to minimize or completely eliminate the spiritual bypass, minimize the whole bliss junkie-ness of being a spiritual practitioner, by connecting deeply, by doing our practices that bring us into the world to serve. We need the action in the world to give our compassion, our wisdom, a drive and a focus, right? So spiritual activism is a marriage of inner peace and outer action. It's the lover. It's the lover inside and the warrior on the outside. This practice gives us the ability to be the vessel, to be the actual vehicle for the fire of justice. And there is a power, you know, a very, very real power in the inner path, in the practices. As the Dalai Lama says, we need an openness to the mystical reality, to the laws of human evolution, and to the power of awakened consciousness enshrined not only in the Tibetan tradition, but in all authentic mystical traditions. I'm convinced, this is the Dalai Lama, not I, Shadi, that the one important step forward for humanity will arrive when scientists and the world in general begin to acknowledge that just as the last 300 years of scientific revolution have opened up a precise awareness of the outer laws of reality, so the ancient mystical tradition offers us a comparable and a precise awareness of the inner laws. So the marriage, right, bringing together the inner law exploration that we're doing with outer action. So rather than using our practice to transcend reality, right, to transcend life, the spiritual activist uses the power of the fire of their practice has generated. They use it as the power of love and embodied wisdom to descend into life, right, into the human experience. And this takes them spiritually and actually much further than they possibly could have reached by trying to transcend. And this depth that they reach inside themselves and in the world is transfigurative. It's transfigurative rather than transcendental. And it cannot be achieved by either path. It can't be achieved by spirituality, and it can't be achieved by activism. It can only be achieved by the fusion of the two, of the spiritual practice and activism for justice that creates an alchemical remedy for our time.